Crush the burden of rising mortgage repayments. We understand that managing your finances can be overwhelming, especially as interest rates continue to rise. With access to 70 plus lenders, our team of specialised brokers will find the best rates for your specific needs. Count on us to secure a lower rate swiftly, giving you the confidence you deserve. Book an appointment with one of our experts today to protect your financial well-being and secure your future. Call us now at 02 8866 2444 or visit our website at finny.com.au.
This is a Momentum Media production.
The SMSF Adviser Show. Your expert insights into the biggest themes shaping the SMSF advice industry.
Hello and welcome to the SMSF Adviser Show. I'm your host, Keith Ford, joined as always by my co-host, Aaron Dunn from Smarter SMSF. How are you, Aaron?
Very good, Keith. Yourself?
Yes, doing well. Just, figuring out everything that's going on in what's been quite a busy week of SMSF news. Of course, we have had a 2-week gap instead of the temporary 1-week gap that we'd been having between episodes, and some things happened.
Well, it's funny when you get government that decides to go back to Parliament and start to push things forward. Well, yes, there is that ever-present thing of news then coming about again. So it's nice to see, because we did feel like for a little while that things had just been a bit light on and we'd sort of been going through the motions. But hopefully now the rubber is about to hit the road. So on that note, let's have a bit of a discussion about what's making news.
Yes, well, the first and I guess the biggest piece of news is that the objective of super is back on deck, and in a bit more of a substantial, in a more substantial way than the last time we talked about it. Of course, What basically prompted it last time was the mere mention of the super objective by Stephen Jones, the Assistant Treasurer and Financial Services Minister. But this time we actually have a consultation happening. What can you tell us about this, Aaron?
Yeah, well, I guess to this extent, we actually have an exposure draft. So Treasury has released the draft bill, so Superannuation Objective Bill 2023, that following this period of consultation will ultimately get finalised and get introduced into Parliament. So
it's getting close.
Yeah, we are. We're getting much closer than we have had for quite some period of time. And I think there's a couple of things that we can take away from what has been added into the exposure draft. So first and foremost, earlier in the year when we talked about this through consultation, there was discussion about, is this going to be a standalone piece of legislation, or is it going to actually sit within the existing confines of the SIS Act and regulations? Well, this now makes it clear it will be its own piece of legislation, but won't step on the toes of other elements of the SIS Acts and SIS regs. So things like sole purpose tests and so forth are still there. So ultimately what this objective is going to be doing is any time we see legislation being introduced into Parliament, just like we have to do with human rights and other things, that it needs to be, as it's being introduced, it needs to be tested ultimately against the objective. And this objective, is defined as, in the proposed exposure draft, to preserve savings in which to deliver income for a dignified retirement alongside government support in an equitable and sustainable way. So that is the objective. There's no real change to that. And some of the commentary that they had at the start of the year where they looked at defining some of these elements haven't really changed, but they have put just a little bit more information within the explanatory memorandum about how they're going to be looking at those topics as well.
That's right. And so obviously some of those key terms that are in the exposure draft, they're terms that may not mean the same thing to everyone. And so then the definition of those terms is important. So definitions of terms like preserving savings, delivering income, dignified is a big one there. What qualifies as a dignified retirement, of course, what qualifies as being equitable, and what qualifies as being sustainable. They're the kind of the broad terms that need to have some kind of definition so that everyone that's working on this understands what's happening and is able to kind of, I guess, move forward with that and work everything so that is meeting that objective.
Yeah. And a good example in here, they refer to around the delivering of income. And the objective that they talk about there is for it not to be prescriptive insofar that, you know, the view may have been when you read the initial consultation that maybe they were going to reinforce some type of mandated drawdown at age 65. Whereas as you start to read the EM here, it actually talks about the flexibility that you can actually do to deliver that income. So what that means is, well, if you want to take a lump sum, you can, and then you might be not using superannuation. You might be using your own personal circumstances, some other non-superannuation structure to hold that. But the mechanism has been that you've saved it for retirement and you've got concessional tax treatment, and you'll be using that for a purpose in retirement that is still linked to cost of living, transport, health, aged care, and all those things. So yes, we ordinarily talk about the fact that you might want to draw a pension, and the large majority of people will probably go down that path. But the reality is it's not going to be in a prescriptive form that says that's what you must do. There will still be opportunities to think about how that income would be delivered based upon each individual's circumstances.
Yes. And of course, there's a lot in the draft legislation, as there is with any draft legislation. There's a lot in there people can submit. So anyone who's listening who has a particular interest in providing submissions, obviously all of the industry bodies and things will be making their submissions and putting things together, but they've got until September 29th. So that's, I guess, that next date that we'll start to get a bit of an understanding, because post September 29, there'll be a date. It won't be on September 29, of course, but you'll start to see the submissions being released either by the industry bodies themselves or eventually by the government. We'll see what people have been suggesting and start to get an idea of where things will move and what the government might take up, I suppose.
Yeah. So Keith, the real interesting one for me will be like, how quickly do the government pull the trigger then on the $3 million policy legislation? Because they were pretty trigger happy when it came from the initial consultation on the objective to the $3 million measures. Like, we were literally, within a week, we saw this thing kind of cross over each other. And now maybe the government is going back and saying, we got to lock this stuff down first before we start to make those changes. Or will we kind of see these two things work in tandem, whereby we will shortly then get the similar exposure draft that would deal with the $3 million measure, and then we'll go through that same process as well.
Right. You never know. It could be up before the podcast hits the airwaves. You never know. However, on that note, it is a very good segue into the next piece of news, which is all about the $3 million super tax. Broadly speaking, about the Greens' response to it, pretty much, which essentially, they're holding it hostage in effect so that they can get their own reforms in place. The large one being that the Greens want a guaranteed paid parental leave to include superannuation. So if you're taking paid parental leave and you're taking the paid parental leave payment from the government, which lasts for, I can't remember how long that lasts for, but it does not include anything going towards your superannuation. So what the Greens want is for the superannuation to be added to the paid parental leave payments, and they're not very keen on letting the $3 million super tax go through without that being added on. In response to this, the SMSF Association CEO, Peter Burgess, has said that there are plenty of other reasons why the Greens and others should not support the proposed new tax on large super balances, pretty much using the Greens' opposition here as a way to reiterate all of the criticisms that they've levied previously on the $3 million super tax, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, the reality of it is when you listen to the demands of the Greens here, the demands are simply at a policy level. So they're only focused on, this is going to raise revenue. We know you need our support to get this through. We don't appear to be interested whatsoever in the technical deficiencies that have been raised over a period of time since this announcement was made earlier in the year, that have been constantly sort of put to the government. So their interest at that level appears to be non-existent. So therefore, if they actually get the paid parental leave piece, then the Labor government really have the ability to take this all the way through unimpeded, and therefore the result that we would have is something that was quite clearly not the outcome that the SMSF industry would want. So yeah, it's quite frustrating, but this is the reality that we sit within a government that doesn't have a majority, right? So yes, we're going to see it get introduced into Parliament. It'll then go into the Senate, and the Senate is really where the jockeying for position is going to happen, both on a political party side, but also through lobbying as well. So there is going to be a lot more water under the bridge until this is resolved. But yeah, this to me is the Greens kind of trying to put their stake in the ground to go, well, if you want it through and you want our help, you need to give us the chop out too.
That's right. And so essentially in the Senate, Greens effectively hold the balance of power.
Yeah.
If Labor wanted to get it through in its current form, not including the paid parental leave, the way it looks at the moment is they'll have to, get some support from other places.
Yeah.
That's probably where anyone such as the SMSF Association and other industry stakeholders, if they're wanting it to get some changes, they might be able to convince some others, perhaps the Liberal Party, to support an amended $3 million super tax, changing some of the ways that it works, if they want that to happen. Now, whether there's much chance of that being a negotiation that happens anywhere in the Senate, that's completely, hypothetical. But that's kind of the only way, because if you're hoping that the Greens holding out on this is going to change the actual body of the legislation, you're probably not going to have a lot of success, because they're really looking at it as, sure, yep, let it go through, but you got to add our thing on. So if you add our thing on, we're good to go. So if Labor does agree to the paid parental leave, it's likely to go through as however Labor wants it to go through, probably.
Yep. Yeah, I reckon that's a very, very, very accurate assessment.
It's a political consideration rather than, as you mentioned, technical.
Yeah.
On something that is a bit technical, we've had some ATO news as well. So we've had the SMSF auditor outcomes for the previous financial year have been released by the Australian Taxation Office. And we also have the compliance activity from the ATO. Now, a couple of interesting high-level numbers in there for the SMSF auditor outcomes. There's been 41 SMSF auditors that were referred to ASIC during the 2022-23 financial year, which is up from, pretty significantly up from 17 in the previous financial year. And the ATO notes that it's the highest rate of referral to ASIC in 5 years. And the highs keep coming pretty much when you look on the other side. 753 trustees were disqualified and added to the public register. That, I believe, is the highest number ever. Significantly highest number ever.
Yep.
And there was about $29 million in additional income tax liabilities, administrative and tax shortfall penalties, and interest imposed upon SMSF trustees and or members. It's a lot to mull over there, Aaron, but what do you get from this breakdown of these numbers?
Well, it's the old adage that the ATO is clearly moving from education to enforcement in a range of things, and that the dialogue from the ATO post-COVID has certainly changed. So when we talk about the auditor issues first, one of the big things, of course, is we saw some fairly substantial changes to the auditor independence requirements a couple of years ago. And when we look at the most common breaches that had been referred to ASIC, there were things around breaches of independence with that in-house audit activity, insufficient audit evidence for market valuations of related party, failure around document quality for the completion of the audit, and failure to identify contraventions and so forth as well. So, yeah, this is in addition, of course, to the cancellation of about another 413 audits. So that the audit industry is certainly contracting, but it's becoming a very specialized field, which is what it wanted to be in the first place. But making sure those that are in it are adequately skilled, both in an SMSF context, but also in an audit context. And the ATO plays their role as part of that auditing the auditor program. And then where they see the deficiencies, they can then obviously refer that to ASIC that control the registration process for auditors. On the compliance side for trustees, like you said, it's quite a significant jump in terms of the number of trustees that have now been disqualified. And I guess, again, this is the ATO's approach to saying we only want people in this sector that are prepared to commit to their obligations as being a trustee of the fund, and that you will abide by the rules that govern your right to be able to run a self-managed super fund. And so the 753 is one part, but then you look at the quantum of penalties and stuff that have been applied, both in shortfall and interest. And remember that some of that penalty that's being paid is not necessarily just being paid by the fund. It's actually coming out of the pockets of the individuals themselves, which is the way the administrative penalty regime works within the SMSF industry. So it's not only hurting them in terms of their asset balance in the fund, but it's actually then hurting their own hip pocket for not doing the right thing as well.
Yeah. And to the tune of roughly double from the previous year in terms of the tax and penalties, and about triple the amount of disqualifications, if anyone was interested in just how significant these increases were.
Yeah. And the illegal early access is a big issue, which is clearly a byproduct of, people and the concerns, I guess, off the back of COVID and needing to access money and or scam related activity. So again, it's a really good reminder that if you do see clients that come into some trouble with a compliance issue, go early to the ATO. Don't wait, because the way in which the ATO take an early engagement and voluntary disclosure process versus coming at you after the fact and the fact that you haven't really been inclined to look at changing it, expect very different outcomes in the way in which the regulator will take that particular issue to task.
I guess it's pretty similar. Most of these kind of things, if they have to do the work to find it, they're not going to be very lenient.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, we'll take a quick break now. When we come back, we'll hear from George Haramis, who's the CEO of AccountantsGPS. Welcome back. We are joined now by George Haramis, who is the Chief Executive Officer of moneyGPS and AccountantsGPS. How are you, George?
Very well, thank you, Keith. How are you?
I'm very well as well. Thank you for asking. I thought to kick off, I know that you guys have been in the advice space for quite a long time. And a few months back, you spoke about launching a digital advice association alongside Aberdeen, Advice Intelligence, Ignition Advice. And I know there was a couple of things with Advice Intelligence, a couple of issues with their funding. But is that association still going ahead? Has the government's slow QAR response kind of hindered the plan at all, or anything along those lines?
Well, just thank you for asking. Firstly, yes, the association is definitely going ahead. I'm pleased to say that Advice Intelligence is back and up and running as it was before. They had a bit of a hiccup.
That's right. They got some additional funding brought in, which was obviously good on their end.
Correct. That's right. You don't want to see any business go through that type of situation, particularly when there's a lot of commitment in terms of dollars and human effort to get it up and running.
Absolutely.
But absolutely, the association is going ahead. The government's not so much a delay, but I guess cherry picking of the quality advice review recommendation hasn't hindered that. If anything, it's made it more of an imperative because unfortunately the government didn't agree to all of the recommendations so far. As I said, they've cherry picked. So it makes, for some players, makes it more difficult to get into the digital advice space, as you've seen with Aberdeen's comments over the past sort of couple of months. But no, very much looking to getting the association up and running fairly shortly.
And I guess the perhaps exclusion of the good advice or I guess not adopting it yet. I guess it's not completely clear whether it will be adopted at some point, but that's probably one of the areas that would make things, I guess, a little harder.
Absolutely. Adopting the good advice principle would have made it a lot easier to deliver personal advice. From the recommendations made by Michelle Levy, it just would have been fit for purpose for many people who can't afford traditional advice or their circumstances don't need a traditional advice approach. Yeah. So they need advice for a particular issue at a particular point in time. Good advice would have been the perfect solution. Unfortunately, it hasn't been adopted as yet. And I hope to see the government review that decision in the future.
And I guess that does kind of lead me to another question in that digital advice being a way to get more advice to more people and doing it quickly, I suppose that's something that is at the core of your business and what you do.
Yes.
You do, I guess, with this, piecemeal approach or cherry picking, as you phrased it, it's hard to get that assurance of what's going to happen and whether the rest of the QAR recommendations are going to be accepted in full. And so what do you think of the current government QAR response and what it means for digital advice in Australia?
Let me first start with the digital advice component. I firmly believe that digital advice is here to stay. I also believe that it is being viewed by a number of sectors within the financial services, superannuation and insurance industry as mainstream. That's certainly been the case with discussions we've been having with organisations across those three parts of the broader financial services sector. So it's here to stay. And one of the underlying objectives of the QAR was to elevate the view of digital advice to more of a mainstream offering than what currently was a couple of years ago, let's say, or even 12 months ago. So I think the timing is perfect. In terms of the government's response, the QAR was created or put together by Michelle as a package, not the recommendations working in silos. So to carve up the QAR, it detracts from achieving the broader objective of delivering affordable advice to the population. I think it's also disappointing from an advisor's perspective, IFAs, that they haven't got as much direction in terms of where QAR is going or the timing of some of those recommendations being adopted. I think that the government's encouragement, let me use that word, of super funds to deliver advice, active encouragement, has placed them in a very interesting situation. There was an article that came out recently with my views, and, I actually feel for those guys because having run a number of AFSLs, having turned around a couple that were in trouble, having run my own boutique AFSL, I know what it's like from both sides of the fence, and I was an advisor for a very short period of time. So I get all of that. And I think the government's approach in encouraging actively, and the regulators' active encouragement of super funds to deliver advice is a very big ask because they were set up to manage people's savings for retirement, and now they're being asked to deliver advice, which I agree to a point, but you need to do this in a way that allows them not to potentially risk their current business, right? Because delivering advice is all about risk mitigation. And you need to have a certain size. This is all about a scale as well. So you need to be of a certain size to deliver an appropriate advice offering. There are various ways to do that, but you have to do it in a very considered way. And you don't want to rush this. This is not to be rushed.
No, absolutely. And your point about the QAR being intended to be kind of taken on in full, yes. It's certainly been Michelle Levy's comments after the government's response. What I suppose her response to the response has been in many ways that idea that taking it in parts, it doesn't really work. And without the good advice part, just the rest of it doesn't kind of pull together, I suppose. No,
it makes it harder. And, even things like a new structure of an SOA, well, what is that going to be?
Consultations are ongoing.
I know that. Lots of consultations. Advisors have got their practices set up in a certain way. They've got their processes and systems. That's why that lends to efficiencies. So, what is the structure going forward? I know that'll be communicated in time, but this sort of waiting doesn't help anybody.
I suppose one of those points has been, there has been some roundtables with Treasury on the quality of advice review with some of the associations. We heard recently from Sarah Abood, the chief executive of the FAAA, for instance, that many funds actually not all that keen on the idea of getting back into advice, which is something you kind of alluded to there. But I guess I just thought maybe expand on your thoughts there and whether you yourself, as part of this burgeoning digital advice association, whether you've been invited in on any of these roundtables as well.
We have. I couldn't make it to the one in Canberra when that was set for groups such as the digital advice providers. I think one of our colleagues went to that or maybe listened in. Those types of sessions, from what I saw of the agendas, were more administrative than anything else. So I can't really comment on what came out of those sessions. I can comment on Sarah's feedback, though, which is quite interesting. That sort of lends itself to the comments I've been making of late, that it is a big ask for super funds to deliver advice. I know if you're of a certain size, as I mentioned, you have the resource to set up your own internal traditional advice business. But all we hear about is traditional advice. That is a scale game, and it is a risk mitigation exercise at the very start of that. The delivery of digital advice can be undertaken in a much more scalable way, cost effective, and you can limit the risk or mitigate the risk considerably if it is done or undertaken in a certain way. We've reviewed this with a couple of super funds and AFSLs, and now talking to a lot of boutiques who are looking to introduce digital advice because they see it as a way to engage and nurture clients that perhaps can't afford their traditional advice services. So, as I mentioned, I think I would urge caution and do it slowly to make sure that everybody understands what the pros and cons are, particularly the risks and how to mitigate those risks. I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but the last thing you want to do as a responsible manager is see an incident take place that, would cause both the client and the institution grief.
I suppose that idea of moving slowly is certainly something that many would think that super funds should be operating that way. I'm sure many would agree with you. I think the problem is that most advisors probably don't think that's what they're going to do. They're a bit skeptical. Advisors have been burned in these kind of areas before, and I think they're a bit skeptical of really any institutions kind of re-entering advice, I suppose.
I understand that. I fully appreciate that, having run my own boutique and also running a number of AFSLs. I would say, to ease the advisors' minds to some degree, that super funds will not move quickly unless, someone forces them to. And they shouldn't move too quickly, but they should examine all aspects of how they can introduce advice proactively and in a timely manner, because there are people waiting to receive advice, and they would prefer the advice to come from their accountant or their advisor or their super fund. I would suspect that, they would dearly love to engage their super fund or accountant advisor if they could receive affordable advice, which is where digital comes in across the board, because it's the digital solution that would satisfy the bulk of the population. Yeah.
Yeah. And I believe that recently announced was that moneyGPS is rolling out a white label digital advice product.
Yeah.
That is for super funds so that they can, meet their retirement income covenant obligations.
Yeah.
Would you be able to give us a little bit more information on that?
Sure. The white label service is actually being rolled out to super funds, boutique AFSLs and larger AFSLs if they choose to use it, and accounting firms.
Right.
Because the one thing that we realize with our technology, and I'll keep the plug brief, is that we always say it's quite configurable and customizable. And then we realize, well, hey, I know super funds are in a position where they can't make decisions too quickly because of their situation and so on. So let's open up the platform. We're able to scale the one platform and white label the product in terms of, logo colors for accountants to deliver professional compliant advice to their clients in a very cost-effective way. For the boutiques, we can actually include their advice services, lending, insurance, a range of different services they've got in their practice, which could cater for clients who are perhaps not yet ready to meet with an advisor, but we can engage and nurture and educate those people. And so that's super funds, accountants, and advisors. And for the super funds, for those super funds who would prefer to deliver advice using an external license, using an external digital advice license, we have one of those as well. We've got several licenses. So we can deliver the advice under our AFSL under a white label scenario, assuming all the advice rules stay consistent to what they currently are, in a very timely manner and very cost effective. So you're not spending, well, it's not a cheap exercise, but you're not undertaking a full SaaS licensing of the technology exercise, which is very expensive and timely. Takes quite some time to get that right to implement.
Yeah.
So the white label covers accountants, boutiques and larger AFSLs and super funds. It's a pure SaaS offering, so it's fee for service. There's no commission involved. It's a subscription fee. And if any subscriber across those three channels has their own products to input, they keep the revenue. We don't touch any of the revenue. In fact, we rebate 80% of any financial service trail or commission to the subscriber, and 20% goes to charity.
Right.
Yeah.
Always nice.
Well, I think, we're in a situation where financial services has always been a rewarding environment. So, why not have some of that reward go to people that probably need it a lot more than we do?
Absolutely. And I guess semi-related to that and touched on it a little bit, but I guess, do you think that super funds will plug that advice gap? There's a lot around whether they can, whether they're going to want to, but do you think they actually will?
That's a very good question. Let me get out my crystal ball and shine it up. Look, I would say that I would love, as a starting point, because they have a lot of data, superannuation fund data that can be used to pre-populate questionnaires and all those types of things that people hate filling out. I think as a starting point, there's two types of clients that they need to cater for. Well, actually three. There's the sort of the general member who's sort of accumulating their wealth. There's the pre-retiree, and there's the person who'll get retirement income. Now, digital can cater for most of those situations, certainly the accumulation and building of wealth. Pre-retirement, retirement income, we're just about there with a retirement income SOA. And you've always got your traditional advice services to cater for, complex situations. So they've got choice where they can put together a package and really deliver a first-class solution. I know there are consulting groups that can help them do that, as well as the association. And we're quite, I'm sure the association would be more than pleased to engage with super funds and institutions to help them do that. So I'd like to see them do that. I think everybody would like to see them do that. And there's nothing wrong in competition, right?
Look, I think some advisors might disagree on that final point.
Well, I hear advisors are getting smashed because there's so much business out there, given the number. It's the old supply and demand. So, we don't want to get too greedy about this. There's 12 to 13 million working Australians who would dearly love advice on a given day, right? And I've seen what happens when people make decisions when they don't get advice, when they don't seek advice, when they think they can't afford advice. And it's not pretty, particularly if they cancel things like insurance and then they become ill, which I've seen personally. So,
and I guess there is the idea that quite a few people that I've spoken to and we've heard on the podcast before have kind of gone with that idea that the ideal situation, if super funds are going to be in advice, is that they're taking care of the simple within what you need to know within your super fund. And then once it goes beyond that scope, it can be referred out to advisors. And so giving that base level to more people, and then advisors taking on once they get beyond a certain point, I suppose. Yeah.
And look, if you're not in a position to have your own internal advisory or comprehensive advice business, traditional business, then the option is to refer that out or to have a relationship with a national group that can cater for your needs. I'm not a big fan of panels because, you can't control the consistency of advice, pricing, compliance. That's the biggie. And, I guess the bent of the institution as to where they invest and so on. But they do have that option, and I know some super funds use it. But yes, there are options there for a super fund to deliver a fairly comprehensive service these days.
Now, a little bit on, I guess, how super funds are performing is that we recently saw the results of the APRA's latest test, its performance test, which it's pulled in a bit more. It's now got some of the choice products, the what they refer to as the trustee directed products, the TDPs. Mm-hmm. I believe I got that right. And it found that 96 products actually failed the test. It was predominantly Insignia and AMP products. I think they accounted for around 75% of the failures. What were your thoughts when you kind of saw these results of the performance test and how products were performing?
Well, pretty disappointing from anyone's standards. I also would expect advisors to field a few questions going forward on these things. Look, I can't comment on the funds themselves. It's the institutions that bear the responsibility of, putting these things together and making them or offering them to the public and members. So that's all I'd rather say on that. I think it's back to the institution, and I'm sure there's a lot of soul searching, particularly for those two groups that you've mentioned, in terms of, well, how are we going to get this right going forward? Because we don't want people to be in this situation. And then that's the final bit, right? You don't want any client to be in a product that is not working, that it's not achieving its objectives. So I would have thought that you'd have ongoing reviews of products and services to make sure that they do meet certain criteria. But hey, I'm outside those businesses, so I can't comment too much.
No, fair enough. Something that you, I'm sure, can comment on. You'll be in October. You're going to be part of the SMSF Adviser Technical Strategy Day for 2023 across 3 states. I believe Sydney on the 17th, Brisbane on the 18th, and then Melbourne on the 25th. I'm pretty sure I got all those dates right.
Yeah, sounds good.
I should have pulled it up first, but that is something that you're a partner of and also going to be doing a brief presentation at the event. What are you essentially, as accountants GPS, mostly trying to get across?
Yeah, okay. Look, thanks for the question, because accountants GPS was established to deliver a number of digital products to the profession. And having run my own boutique AFSL, I had 35 accounting practices licensed to me for SMSF purposes. Those people did the right thing and, paid for the course and did the training and, provided SOAs to their clients for SMSF purposes. And then the whole thing just fell away due to the lack of regular, enforcement and follow through by the regulators. Now, we realized that when we were building moneyGPS that the tech should be able to extend itself to look at non-personal products. So what we've built is an SMSF checkup report, which we fortunately API'd into BGL. We collaborated with BGL, which is I think it's the largest SMSF administrator in the country, and produced the digital product SMSF checkup report. The report itself can, within a few minutes, complete a strategic review of an SMSF, regardless of size, how many investment properties, members, and so on. It will allow the accountant to have a fairly well-structured strategic discussion with the clients. It is a factual report, so it's not advice. So whilst the accountant can provide guidance, any advice requirement from that report can be delivered by us or advisors or their respective advisors if they're working with externals or internal ARs. It will allow the accountants to talk about compliance and regulatory updates and what the fund needs to do, look at asset allocation versus benchmarks, performances of equities and direct property, recontribution strategies, estate planning, insurance, lots of things. It's an Australian first. We made the finals of the 2023 Tech Scale-Up Awards this year and only been in operation for about 4 months, which was, quite exciting and very rewarding. We didn't win it this year, but maybe next year. I've been told we can reapply. But I just thought that was a great result. And I can tell you that, we've been talking to lots of accountants, hundreds of them actually around the country, and receiving extraordinary responses, very, very positive responses, because now an accountant, just like the moneyGPS platform where you can deliver advice to people who need it, we can deliver a strategic tool that's never been offered before to work in a sector that looks after 26% of the total superannuation industry assets, which is a big call. So that's what I'll be talking about at each of the days with SMSF Adviser. And we'll be refining that document as we go forward. But again, that's also offered under a subscription pricing structure for all BGL users.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time today, George. And of course, for partnering with the Technical Strategy Day and coming along to the events. I'm sure there'll be a great couple of days.
Thanks very much, Keith. We really are very pleased to be a partner of SMSF Adviser. I look forward to the strategy days, and I look forward to catching up with lots of accountants and lots of advisors during those 3 days as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining the show.
My pleasure. Thanks again, Keith.
All right, back with Aaron Dunn now to wrap up the week. Aaron, what happened that you think was the most interesting this last week?
Oh, without question, we have seen some movement on the objective of super.
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
Yeah. Well, I guess, we've been talking about it ad nauseum, haven't we? Is it coming? Is it not coming? And finally, like I said earlier, I think the rubber's starting to hit the road and we're getting a little bit more information on it. So whilst, this is a broader, important topic, it's going to then shape what this government might look to do as we move forward. And of course, that $3 million earnings threshold forms part of that as well. So, yeah, I'm really interested not only in seeing where and how quickly this gets finalised, but then what the government may look to do thereafter, both in terms of any policy announcements shortly thereafter, being the $3 million stuff, and then what may arise thereafter with the budget next year too.
Yeah, it certainly does seem as though, as you mentioned, these two measures are kind of joined at the hip a little bit. And so getting that idea of where the next movement's going to come is also very interesting. As of yet, we've not heard anything more about the $3 million outside of the greens, which we broke down a bit earlier. But getting that, everyone just wants to know what's happening. So as we make progress on the objective of super, if we're then making progress on other areas, I guess that's good in terms of at least knowing what's happening, even if many within the sector are not too happy with the $3 million tax.
Yeah. Well, Keith, one thing I can say, if Minister Jones does listen, we do have our SMSF Adviser Technical Strategy Days coming up. So if you want to drop any draft legislation out for our audience to take advantage of and listen to that as part of the great topics that we have for those upcoming events, that would be the one thing that would be fantastic.
Look, it would throw a little bit of a spanner into the agenda, but it would be pretty good to be able to have some idea and then, maybe rework a couple of things in some presentations so that people can get a bit around that. And for people who are listening and don't know what the Technical Strategy Day is, which seems hard to believe if you listen to any previous episodes. But so the SMSF Adviser Technical Strategy Day for 2023, which is emceed by Aaron here, happening in Sydney on the 17th of October, Brisbane on the 18th, Melbourne on the 25th of October. You can get your tickets now. If you are in another state and you want to watch a live stream of the sessions, you can also do that. Just go onto the SMSF Adviser website and you'll be able to find the details.
Or they could fly over to one of the locations and enjoy being in person for the events, because they are a fantastic day.
They might even be able to meet the MC.
Well, I'm happy to give him a pair of socks or a T-shirt, one of our smarter SMSF ones. Well, as is always the way, Keith, to wrap up, if anyone has any suggestions on topics, speakers and the like, how can they get in contact with us?
Yep, they can just let us know at editor@smsfadvisoronline.com.au and hit us up with all your comments and suggestions.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again for joining us with this week's edition of the SMSF Adviser Show. Have a great rest of the week. Take care and bye for now.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
Are you an SMSF advisor struggling to keep up to date amid the ever-evolving Australian superannuation industry? Join us at the SMSF Adviser Technical Strategy Day 2023 in Sydney, Brisbane or Melbourne this October to discover revolutionary tools, insights and market intelligence that'll help you dominate in the year ahead and beyond. Take part in interactive discussions with specialist speakers on SMSF regulation and compliance, investment strategies, tax planning, estate planning, retirement planning and more. Network with SMSF leaders, your fellow peers, and earn CPD accreditation to further your professional development. Visit smsfstrategyday.com.au to learn more about the event, our specialist speakers, and to secure your ticket.